Okay, in this screencast, we are going to talk about choosing and integrating quotes. And this is just an introduction. Okay, so let's start with when to quote. So, quotations are used to support your own ideas. They should not take the place of your ideas. So, quotes are a great place to show that proof, that evidence from a piece of literature that helps to support the argument that you're trying to prove. Now, when writing in response to literature, they should not be used to tell the story. And do keep that in mind. We are avoiding any kind of summarizing of stories when we're writing about literature. We want to have a solid topic sentence, a solid thesis statement. We want to build that as an argument. Now, using the chunking method for paragraph development, quotes are most often found in the concrete detail sentence, but they can be used elsewhere as well. So don't feel limited by that. But that concrete detail, that piece of evidence, is often where we put our quote. Okay, so effective quotes are well chosen, properly integrated, and punctuated correctly. So for today, we're just focusing on the first two, how to choose a good quote, how to integrate it into your own sentences, and in a future lesson, we will talk about how to properly punctuate quotes. Okay, so let's start with choosing the right quotes. Now, this is vital. What you choose to quote is so important because using quoted material is meant to give more validity to your argument. You need to find a quote that does just that. When writing in response to literature, quoted material includes the following. It can be narration from the story, or it can be dialogue. Let's look at an example. So in my paper over the short story The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, I want to use quotes to support my chosen theme. So I've determined that the theme of the story is around the irrational nature of blindly following traditions. And I want to use the literary element of characterization to prove this. After reading the story, I've decided to use Old Man Warner, and since my literary element is characterization, as I said above, I have chosen to quote dialogue. So let's have a look at an excerpt from the original text. So I'm thinking about my theme. I remember this one scene where some people in the audience are interacting with Old Man Warner, and I recall the things that he said in his response. So here's the original text. "They do say," Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." Old Man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said. "Listening to the young folks. Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he added petulantly. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody." "Some places have already quit lotteries," Mr. Adams said. "Nothing but trouble in that," Old Man Warner said stoutly. "Pack of young fools." So you notice he's Old Man Warner, and he's talking about young fools and that people are crazy and that this is how it's always been done. And this is a lot of really great evidence, but this is way too much to quote. So how do I decide what I want to take out of this? How do I decide what pieces really help me support my ideas? You know, there's more than one answer, of course, depending on how you frame your argument. But here, this example is meant to show how to be selective when choosing exactly what part of the information to quote. So that whole section, like I said, shows a character, Old Man Warner, blindly following tradition. But like I said, it was way too long to quote. So because I'm focusing on Old Man Warner's character to prove my theme, so if you remember that's my focus for this paragraph, I really need his words. I can simply paraphrase or make a nod to the context of the dialogue to get my point across. So check out the start of my paragraph, and noticing my topic sentence here for this paragraph is really a big part of how I choose what it is from the story that I want to quote. In The Lottery, Shirley Jackson uses characterization to emphasize the irrational nature of blindly following traditions. Old Man Warner's character demonstrates his irrational adherence to tradition when he says, quote, "Pack of crazy fools, there's always been a lottery," end quote, in response to any suggestion of deviation from tradition. So notice that very last line there, in response to any suggestion of deviation from tradition. So I'm giving that context from the story of where he said this and what this was his response to other people suggesting that they no longer do the lottery. And so notice in the quote as well that here I have included ellipses, because what I've done is I liked this part, pack of crazy fools, and then there's always been a lottery. That really shows this is why we do it, because we always have. And that in itself is irrational, and it demonstrates that this lottery is a tradition. So this is how I avoided summary when I included my quote. Now do remember that the next two sentences are then going to be those commentary sentences. Those are going to be the sentences where I make the connection between this quote and the fact that this represents irrational nature of following traditions, which I've kind of just talked through. All right, so the second aspect for today is properly integrating quotes. Successful quotes are properly integrated, and it's really important to remember this always, and it's easy to remember, and it applies really to anything. The words in the quote should fit stylistically and grammatically into your own sentence. You're using someone else's words correctly in your own sentence. And of course, as always, a quote must be identical to the original source. And when we talk about punctuating quotes, we can talk a little bit about when you need to make a few changes to the quote in order to allow it to fit into your sentence stylistically and grammatically. But that is in another lesson. So the first tip here at the top is to avoid floating quotes. So a really common error made when including a quote is just simply having that quote in a sentence all by itself. We call this a floating quote. So this is not acceptable because the quote is included without any specific analytical context. It's like just cut and paste and glued in there, and we really need to integrate it. Now, how do we do that? We do that by using something called signal phrases. So a signal phrase introduces the quote and gives the reader a context for the quote that explains why you are taking the time to include it in your paper. Now, there are three ways to use signal phrases. We can do this with a complete sentence followed by a colon, with an incomplete sentence followed by a comma, or with a statement that ends in that, making sure that that signal phrase introduces or integrates that quote really well into your own sentence, stylistically and grammatically correct. Let's look at some examples of each. Okay, so first example, with a complete sentence followed by a colon. This comes from The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. Montresor feels guilt for burying Fortunato alive in the catacombs, although he tries not to acknowledge this feeling. Quote, my heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. So notice how that quote is showing that guilt, this feeling that he's having. So that quote really gives us context. That signal phrase gives us the context for this quote. And we're understanding his meaning behind this quote that he said. Second example is with an incomplete sentence followed by a comma. So after securing Fortunato to the wall of the catacombs, quote, Montresor began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. So again, without summarizing the story, we are instead integrating something directly from the story into our own sentence and giving some context here. Notice that this quote is not dialogue. This quote is narration. And also notice that when we talk about grammatically and stylistically fitting our quote into our own sentence, this was necessary. In the original story, this was a he. And because Fortunato's name is here, the he could have been confusing to the reader. So we use the brackets to replace the he with Montresor. We have not changed the meaning of the quote, but we do have to show with punctuation that we have made a bit of a change. Last example. We can integrate quotes with the statement that ends in the word that. The reader can recognize Montresor's guilt for burying Fortunato alive in the catacombs, because immediately after doing so, he admits that, quote, his heart grew sick. So again, I've used a piece of that quote that I used in the very first example, and I've integrated it into a sentence that then has the word that. Great. So in a future lesson, we will address the proper way to punctuate your quotes, as I mentioned before. But for now, I want you to really focus on choosing your quotes wisely and integrating those words smoothly into your own sentences.